Well, let's get some industry perspective right now. We have in studio with us Catherine Cobden, President and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association. Ms. Cobden, thank you for being here.
Thanks very much for having me.
So Ottawa has been quick to react to these tariffs from the United States. What do you make of the measures that you heard today from the ministers?
Yeah, so a couple of things. We were really hopeful that we would respond as a nation right away with the steel tariffs, so we were very pleased about that. We were also hopeful that we wouldn't see an escalation, if you will, in the discussion. We really think this is a time to be calm and measured. And from what we can see from the retaliatory package, it really is like reciprocal in the sense of you put tariffs on that product, we put tariffs on that product. It's 25%. Is 25%. Certainly for the steel aspects of this, that is the case. So, you know, I think that's the right approach. We have to stand up for ourselves. We have to keep the level, you know, we have to stay on level. But escalation is probably not the approach that we would want to see anyway on the steel side.
And in this case, because it's not just Canada giving the counter-tariff, the EU is also issuing its own counter-tariff. How helpful is that? Yeah,
so, you know, I tend to think that the game afoot is to get the U.S. to realize the importance of the trade and the free trade and the allied trade as much as possible. And so definitely having other nations doing their own retaliatory measures is important, because that will help escalate and get, you know, without it being us and without it being at a level beyond the tariffs themselves. That'll help advance, if you will, the circumstances. At least that's what I hope.
What you hope, and you know, and we heard it before, just how reliant American industry is on Canadian steel. Does that help you in this fight to try to get the tariffs removed, or are you concerned that the United States might be able to quickly source steel from elsewhere?
Yeah, I think that this is one of the reasons why the retaliation is important, because in fact our market's also important to them, and that I think is sometimes lost in their moves at what they're doing. So retaliate first to create that level playing field, and then absolutely, you know, over time I hope that we'll see these tariffs, you know, removed, but I don't have any certainty. As you know, over the last 24 hours, there's been a significant amount of uncertainty created on steel tariffs. Was it going to be 25%? Was it going to be 50%? And so, you know, the 6.6 or 7 million tons of steel we send to the United States is at great risk. And, you know, the 25% tariff will make this very difficult. And so I don't know how the U.S. intends to fill that gap. At 50%, it was like an immediate thing. At 25%, it will be damaging, but might, you know, there may still be some movement of steel, not at the volumes we've had, but there'll be some, I anticipate. But it's a good question. You'll have to pose that to them. I'd like to know where they expect to get that. We know there's an excess of capacity from China, so they could potentially, you know, obviously China would be happy to fill that void. But of course, we also know there's a lot of unfair trade associated with that steel. So. Yeah.
So, you know, as you say, we'll have to see how the Americans respond to it. But in terms of the industry here in Canada, what impact will the tariffs that came into effect at midnight early this morning will have on the industry here and on workers?
Well, it's already had an impact even before we went to bed last night. Unfortunately, the threat of tariffs and then all this volatility has created, you know, I'm going to say, impacts in three distinct ways. One is some job losses. So certain companies have announced already job cuts. We've seen production curtailment, so just, you know, pulling back, not producing as much. And also, and what's really hard to see is the decisions to defer investments until things are less volatile. So those are three really impactful, you know, circumstances on the domestic industry. But I don't want to stop there, because I do think there are significant impacts downstream as well, again, in Canada and the United States, as they're also trying to understand where's the steel going to come from, how much will we pay. And as we see prices surge, they've already been surging, you know, I think that's going to become a really interesting challenge. We have a very, you know, difficult economic circumstance for many people. They're really struggling with inflation and you know, how to make ends meet. And at the same time, we're seeing these prices escalate.
So what do you need then from Ottawa? Because, beyond the countermeasures, Ottawa is empowered, as are provincial governments across the country, empowered to do something. What do you hope to get from them?
So thank you for that question, because in fact, with all this volatility, we've come to the determination that we have to actually do what we can control. And what we can control is our own market. And at this moment, there's a lot of unfair trade going on in our market. So Canadian steel producers don't mind, obviously, competing for business. But when we compete with unfair traders where they're dramatically undercutting prices, they don't have employment standards or environmental standards, it's really problematic for us. And so while almost everything we send to the United States, something like 95% of our shipments to the United States is melted and poured in the USMCA region, in our own country, we're only serving like less than 40%, right? So this is something we need with Canadian steel. So we really hope governments of all levels, by the way, prioritize domestic steel, and also that the federal government take measures at our border to get rid, once and for all, of unfair trade in our domestic market.
Well, we certainly know that the Ontario Premier, as well as the Finance Minister, will be speaking to the U.S. representatives tomorrow, so we'll be watching that. But for now, Catherine Cobden, thank you for this.
Thank you very much.